Welcome back to the deep dive. So previously, specifically in our discussion around episode 21's material, we touched on this really unsettling idea we labeled Armageddon programming.
Right. The basic concept was a deliberate attempt to sort of take male sexual attention and redirect it, twist it into, well, into rage.
Exactly. And today, we want to dig into what might be the building blocks for that kind of programming. We're looking at some things that seem, pretty unrelated at first glance.
Yeah, things like Mickey Mouse, this concept of Oz programming, even ideas around spell casting.
And then we'll try to connect that foundation to a specific example, The Catcher in the Rye.
Mm-hmm.
Now, fair warning, like we mentioned before, some of this gets into, blunt or disturbing territory. But the goal is really to try and understand these potential mechanisms.
Definitely. And maybe to wrap our heads around how these different elements could even possibly lead to something like Armageddon programming, it helps to revisit hypnosis basics. We talked about 8 steps, right? And reinforcement is crucial here. It's that final stage.
So the one that makes it sick.
Yeah, exactly. Making the lesson automatic. So, episode 21 mentioned this Luciferian goal of making something happen on demand.
Like pulling the trigger.
Precisely. That reinforcement would be absolutely key to making a specific reaction, maybe anger from frustration, become almost reflexive, an automatic thing.
Okay, so less conscious thought, more ingrained response.
Got it. So these narratives then, episode 21 talked about Disney-styled nonsense being something people thinking they know the real truth feel free from.
Right.
How does that connect to this Oz programming and the Emerald City, the Rainbow Road stuff from episodes 24 and 25?
Well, think about the Wizard of Oz story. The Emerald City, the end of the Yellow Brick Road.
Oh.
It's presented as, the ultimate goal, this amazing, desirable place.
The magical destination.
Exactly. And episode 24 had that line, what happens in Emerald City stays in Emerald City, which kind of hints at a separate reality, doesn't it? Maybe hidden rules.
Yeah, like a bubble. And then 25 took it further, describing this idea of Lucifer's magic kingdom as a huge Emerald City, but in, the world of the dead.
Okay, wow.
A place designed, supposedly, to keep sins going and distract people from, judgment. So you can see how these seemingly innocent kids' stories might be doing some early mental landscaping.
Planting ideas about illusion, hidden places, what you should want.
Pretty much, setting up these concepts early on.
What about the fear aspect? Episode 21 mentioned fear being used to get consent. How do these stories play into that?
Well, if these narratives present a reality that's maybe skewed or fantastical, it could make it harder for someone to see what's presented as the real truth.
Creates uncertainty.
Yeah, or even fear of what's outside that known comfortable narrative. And that fear, according to the source material, is something controllers might use to get, consent, maybe subconscious consent for their plans.
Okay, this is, quite layered. Let's switch gears slightly to spellcasting. Episode 21 mentioned an ultimate spell, and 22 talked about intonation spells. What's that about?
So the intonation spell idea, the example given in episode 22, was someone just repeating over and over, "The world is safer because of George Bush."
Oh.
Remember that every single man, woman, and child in the state of South Carolina awakens to a freer, safer world because of George Bush. I would remind people that every single morning we all awaken to a safer, freer world because of George Bush. And Nicole, I would remind you and the people of Florence that all of us awaken every single day to a freer, safer world because of George Bush. They themselves awaken every single day to a freer, safer world because of George Bush.
The point wasn't whether it was true or not, but the repetition. The idea is that saying something constantly, with conviction, is an attempt to program public thought.
Like that reinforcement we just talked about.
Exactly like that. It's drilling the idea in, trying to make it a belief through sheer repetition, a kind of societal background hum.
So you've got these foundational stories potentially shaping the subconscious, and then this constant repetition reinforcing specific ideas.
Right.
Now, let's bring in sexuality, because that seems central to this whole Armageddon programming thing.
Right. Episode 21 points to what it calls a purposeful mystification and mythologicalization of human sexuality, supposedly starting generations back.
Mystification.
Yeah.
Making it confusing or secret.
Yeah, obscuring it. And the adult entertainment industry was mentioned as, let's say, a contributing factor. The argument is it shifted away from a time when sexuality was maybe more openly tied to family, community, natural cycles.
Right, when maybe age-old truths about it were passed down more directly. But then secrecy, embarrassment, especially for young men, that connection broke down.
That's the idea presented, that vital knowledge transfer just failed.
And episode 21 also brought up the fluffy bunny idea, like media desensitizing people, maybe suppressing natural urges.
And it also noted that, for many men over 30, those crucial father-son talks about sex just didn't happen.
So this incredibly powerful natural part of life became associated with, what, naughty whispers, childishness, hidden away.
Exactly. Twisted and obscured is the argument. Figures like Hugh Hefner were sometimes mentioned in that context, right or wrong.
Okay, so how does that manipulated view of sexuality link to Armageddon programming, and specifically The Catcher in the Rye?
Well, episode 21 directly proposed that this programming connects arousal, that sexual energy, with death. It used Holden Caulfield as the example.
Holy cow.
His awkward encounters with women, his failures, his confusion, even his really protective feelings for his little sister Phoebe. The suggestion is that within the programming, these things get tangled up with death, or the idea of death.
Okay.
So males are conditioned, supposedly, to a point where that natural energy, instead of finding a healthy outlet, gets snarled up with frustration, feeling inadequate, and then boom, rage.
Redirected energy.
Exactly. Episode 21 even brought up the occult idea of the little death, symbolic death, suggesting a link between losing control sexually or emotionally and the symbolic end.
And that loss of control.
Yeah.
That's connected to a freezing of the mind before violence. That's a really disturbing chain reaction. Sexual tension, frustration, rage, mental freeze violence.
That's the core theory laid out. And then it points, controversially, to figures like Timothy McVeigh, Sirhan, Lee Harvey Oswald, calling them potential robo-assassins.
Examples of the programming in action.
Potentially. According to that source, it links the supposed desensitization of American men to a systemic attack, and even mentions training kids in certain groups, like the Illuminati reference, to use guns effectively from young ages.
As reinforcement for the violence.
As deep early reinforcement for that violent potential, yeah.
So it's framed not just as personal issues, but as a deliberate, large-scale manipulation. Which brings us back to control, like we covered in episode 22.
Precisely. Control in all its forms, right? From just, peer pressure all the way to actual mental slavery. Episode 22 touched on how meeting someone's needs can feel like love, but could actually be a form of manipulation, making them dependent or indebted.
And the occult view.
Yeah.
9 human needs that can be targeted for programming.
Yeah, it was mentioned, yeah. And the idea that intelligence services might even amplify those needs in someone to make them more susceptible to control.
It's a whole system. Starts with stories, gets hammered in by repetition, twists natural drives, exploits basic needs.
And finally, episode 21 just briefly touched on the Judas Clause.
Right, connected to getting consent.
Yeah, the implication being that even in these manipulative setups, there's some perceived need to get agreement, even if it's forced or, subconscious.
So looking at The Catcher in the Rye again, through this lens, it stops being just a story about teenage angst.
Right.
Becomes potentially a case study. How sexual confusion, alienation, frustration, how those feelings could maybe fit into a profile that this Armageddon programming aims to create or exploit. Definitely makes you look at it differently.
It really does. It highlights how things we see as separate, cartoons, books, how we handle sex, might actually be interconnected in ways that shape our deeper beliefs and reactions, much more than we usually think.
Yeah.
And just recognizing these possible mechanisms, understanding how influence might work, that's a really powerful first step, maybe towards resisting it.
So a final thought for you listening. As you go about your week, pay attention to the media you consume, the stories you hear. What messages, subtle or not so subtle, are being sent about, say, sexuality and anger?
What connections are being made?
What could be the potential trigger in programming like this, if it exists? And maybe more importantly, how can you become more aware of these potential influences, both out there in the world and maybe even within yourself?
It's definitely complex, maybe unsettling stuff to think about.
For sure. But critical thinking, just being aware, that's always valuable.